Kiara Koto Katawa. I begin by acknowledging the ancestors of Rangitane, whose land, generosity, and knowledge shapes the space in which we are going to have this dialogue. It's such a pleasure to have with us Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an intellectual who needs no introduction. He is, as I say in my public writing, perhaps one of the foremost voices of the Global South, particularly as we think about registers of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism. His work as director of the Tricontinental Institute is really powerful, and I encourage you to read the work of the Institute, and also with the Leftward Books, of which he is an editor, that actually creates powerful interventions in terms of writing from and of the Global South. So it's a pleasure to have you with us.
What a way to begin. Scary.
So, Vijay, our conversation is built around third world futures. And what I thought is that we begin this conversation by broadly having you talk about what we understand by the third world.
Yeah. I mean, you know, any category, third world, global south, whatever it is, these are approximations of reality. The category itself isn't reality. You know, it's always odd when people say, well, you know, why global south? Because all the countries south of the equator, some of them are north of the equator. You know, these sort of trivial objections. Or why third world? Isn't that demeaning? Why not, you know, the first world or whatever? Those objections to me are annoying because all categories are an approximation, trying to understand a reality that exists, you know, in its own complexity. The third world is an interesting category by itself because it doesn't matter where it comes from. Obviously, it was first coined by a French journalist, but he captured something. He was able to put together something that was happening out there, which is that all these countries were getting free from colonialism. You know, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, leading the pack in a way, then Ghana, and, you know, earlier Latin America had its formal independence in the early 1800s, but really there was a second round with Cuba in 1959 and so on. So there was something happening, and this something that was happening almost 70 years ago now came together at Bandung initially in 1955 in April, and then eventually in 1961 in Belgrade, they create the non-aligned movement. And so, in a sense, politically, this non-aligned movement was the actual instantiation of the concept third world, that they were neither associated with the Western Bloc, nor were they associated with the communist states, the Soviet Union and the Eastern European Communist State Project. China has always had an interesting role in all these things because until recently, China never joined, for instance, the G77, which is the third world grouping in the UN. Now, many more than 77 countries, but when created, it was called the G77. The name has stayed. See, somebody could say, well, why is it called the G77? There's 145 countries there. Well, because that's a historical name, G77. But in the votes, it always used to be G77 plus C, because China never even joined that. So China has always had this interesting relationship until the BRICS, when it joined the BRICS project. Anyway, the third world was something. And I'm just telling you about my own work for a moment. I was extremely frustrated in graduate school in the 1980s when, you know, there was like a emerging discourse about this third world being famine-ridden, corrupt, you know, just wretched, yeah? After the famine in Ethiopia in '84, wretched, corrupt, you know, Peter Bauer, who was a conservative British guy, wrote a book saying this whole third world thing is a disaster, you know, it needs to be wrapped up, we need to think about recolonizing these barbarians. I mean, this was the attitude, and I was so frustrated with that because I felt there was a lack of appreciation for what these countries had tried to do from 1945 to the 1980s. And so that's why when I started writing The Darker Nations, I said there's a third world project. They actually had an intellectual political project about, development, and the UN Conference on Trade and Development was part of the institutional architecture of the third world. This was real. It's not a fake thing. They had an attempt to decolonize the rest of the world. The third committee at the UN was set up at the urging of these newly decolonized countries. They put Palestine, for instance, at the center of deliberations. They talked about something like Western Sahara, which had not been on the agenda. So it wasn't just economics, it was also political. And then, people seem to have forgotten that from the 1950s, at the urging of the Bandung spirit, you had an entire project of going against racism. So at UNESCO, which was based in Paris, there was an enormous push to create curriculum. When I was a child, if you go to a dentist office in India, on the table there'd be a copy of UNESCO Courier, because it was a free magazine the UNESCO provided to third world countries, where you could read about Nigeria and what's happening with literature. It's a little boring magazine. It's sort of a pre-NGO magazine. You know how NGO magazines are deathly boring? There's like some articles you don't want to read. But Korea was like the pre-NGO, that kind of thing, stories of development. It's extremely informative and useful to think about what's happening in other places. So the third world was a real project. And, when I wrote about it, I said it was assassinated. Both literally, that the leaders were assassinated. Lumumba, 1961 in Africa, enormous blow to the third world. The coup in Brazil in 1964, a coup that lasted for 21 years, devastated Latin America, because it's from the Brazilian military that the United States ran Operation Condor, which was essentially to create coups all over the place. In Argentina, where I live, in Santiago, in Chile, the coup in '73. And then in Asia, the most spectacular of them all was the coup in Indonesia, where 1 million communists were slaughtered after 1965. The Australian government played a role in that. The New Zealand government played a role in the Malay emergency, sent New Zealand troops. Whatever sediment of independence you have, you can't claim any longer because you participated in the murder of the Malays trying to get their independence. And then there were New Zealand troops in Vietnam at the urging of the United States, participating to put down the liberation movement in Vietnam. It's really interesting to be in New Zealand, because there's this history of being against the Third World Project, rooted in the National Party, but not only in the National Party. I mean, the others as well participated in consensus in sending New Zealand troops. Maybe it's a consequence of the Treaty of San Francisco, the treaty, ANZUS Treaty. Maybe it's that. Whatever it is, there was the Third World Project, and then there were the Five Eyes. There was United States, New Zealand, Australia, etc., participating in crushing this aspiration for freedom. In New Zealand, Australia, the role it plays in the Indonesian coup is extraordinary. Australian intelligence services were faxing names of people to the Indonesian military who they said should be killed. So of the 1 million people killed, Australia sent lists of people to be erased. It wasn't just, the General Suharto and company who ran that. They got lists from the Five Eyes to, take out the following 20 trade union leaders and so on. So that's the third world. It was killed off. And then it was killed off by the debt crisis, which is a more complicated thing to explain, but I'll be happy to get into that, Mohan. It's a long story, and I don't know why I went on so long. I just thought you threw out like an opener question, and then I sort of exploded, and I don't know. Sorry about that.
Vijay, this is beautiful, because it seems, as you talk about the Third World Project, there are two aspects to the decolonization movement that emerges out of it. One is the notion of cultural sovereignty, but the other, even perhaps more important one, is the idea of economic sovereignty. So could you talk a little bit more about how those two aspects are weaved together in the Third World Project and its ideas of decolonization?
Such a good question, because as you're talking, I'm thinking of the Democratic Republic of Congo, because it's a test case for how these two visions of decolonial or decolonization are in tension, you know. And maybe I'll tell that story in order to go beyond that story. So, you know, when, as I said, Patrice Lumumba leads a very long movement that starts in the 1920s, trade unionists and so on. It's not just that in the 50s, you know, the movement National des Congolese starts. It's got a history before that. But Patrice Lumumba was this amazing political leader. You know, they fight to put the Belgians on the back foot, and then the king of Belgium has to say, okay, they can be free. And the king comes to, you know, Leopoldville, horrible name. Leopold owned this territory 81 times the size of Belgium. That's just unbelievable. And Lumumba looks him in the eye and says, "We are no longer your monkeys." You know, that's a powerful line. He was a great man. "We are no longer your monkeys." And he said, "We are going to have sovereignty." Now, you may not know this, but the nuclear material that the Yanks used to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from a mine that's in Western Democratic Republic of Congo. And the CIA did not want Lumumba to transfer any of that uranium to the Soviets. So they just couldn't have a sovereign DRC. And so you had the beginnings of the rebellion against Lumumba coming in the Katanga province, which was the richest province with copper and so on. And Lumumba was trying to hold together this secessionist movement, which claimed to be an indigenous secessionist movement, but was actually engineered by British, British, American, and Belgian intelligence. There's a great book called White Mischief, which puts all these things together. Anyway, Lumumba is killed, his body is dissolved in acid, some of his teeth are preserved as relics and taken by the Belgians back to Belgium. You know, it's really interesting how colonialists always say that the savage mishandles the body. You know, the United States, they used to say that the native peoples used to scalp the US soldiers. But in fact, it was the US soldiers that scalped the natives. Now, maybe the natives did some scalping, but the way in which the transference occurs, that the savage is always a savage, and the civilized is the civilized. But in 1961, the Belgians dissolved the body of Lumumba in acid and took his teeth back as relics to Brussels. I mean, that's in 61, not in 17 something. That's now. Yeah, I was born in 1967. I was almost alive when they did that to Lumumba's body. Yeah, hideous, right? Civilized Europe, 1961. For God's sake, M.A. César had already written Discourse on Colonialism. You know, the book had already come out after that. After Fanon had written his major work, they dissolved Lumumba's body in acid. It's extraordinary. Get rid of Lumumba. In comes a pro-US guy, his name is Joseph Mobutu. Joseph Mobutu, it's important. The country was called the Democratic Republic of Congo. What does Mobutu do? Mobutu gives Congo to the multinational corporations, so no economic sovereignty. But he changes the name of the country to Zaire, the ancient name, and he changes his name from Joseph Mobutu to Mobutu Seko Sese. And suddenly, he uses cultural decolonial garbage to masquerade for no sovereignty. So cultural decolonial stuff is not necessarily liberation. Because in the Congo, it was utilized as the alibi to then slip all the wealth off back to Europe. And so this tension between the cultural and the economic, you can't break the two. If you particularly only do the cultural, you can have a very conservative neo-colonial economic structure in place. So if these things are not together, and if you do an economic without the cultural, people may not develop a sense of dignity. So it has to always be both. Sankara. when Thomas Sankara takes power in 1983 in a military coup in what was Upper Volta, Sankara says, what the hell? Who names a country Upper Volta? No people say, we live above the Volta River. Let's call our country Upper Volta. That's a stupid colonial name because the Volta River was important for the colonials. He changes the name of the country from the left to Burkina Faso, which means land of upright people. Dignity for the people, not just a colonial geography. Burkina Faso. But at the same time, Sankara says sovereignty over agriculture, sovereignty over the household. Women should not do all the reproductive labor. Sankara was the perfect unity of economic breakdown of the neo-colonial structure and the transformation of a colonial culture. Perfect unity. And then 2 years after all this process starts, he's assassinated. He's killed by Blaise Compaoré, whatever it's called, the intervention of French intelligence. They just don't let these countries survive. That's the key thing.
I want to pick up on that a little bit and sort of interlocute with the work of one of our colleagues here, Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith, who in his articulation of Kaupapa Maori says that the struggle for cultural sovereignty has to connect with structural transformation. And how do you think about questions of structural transformation? So building on that then, the question it seems to be that when one is developing this kind of economic sovereignty, there's pushback from imperial and colonial powers. The pushback comes in the form of, say, all the way from structural adjustment programs to direct forms of violence that are deployed. I would love for you to connect this then to what we are seeing in Gaza right now in terms of the modality of violence as an embedded structure in the colonial imperial apparatus.
You and I were both, you were in India in 1984.
Yeah.
I was in India in 1984. I was in Delhi. In 1984, woke up one morning and there was, the old days. I lived in a fourth floor roof of a house. You put the bucket down, it's a little wicker basket with, 3 rupees in the basket. Nobody took the money, just the newspaper guy would put the newspaper in, take the money and bicycle off to the next house, and I would pull my newspaper up and I opened the newspaper and I would never forget this. A factory in Bhopal had exploded that night and thousands of people had died. And the story was Bhopal Tragedy. Actually, the next day's news in the Indian Express was Bhopal Tragedy. It was an amazing headline to start the thing. And I thought, what the hell, man? Factory exploded. Now, initially, Union Carbide, which owned the factory, said, well, we didn't know, it was a mistake, whatever. Later, years later, with a lot of pressure from political organizations, survivors' families, a lot of struggle, it turned out that Union Carbide knew exactly what was happening. They just neglected to fix anything and so on. Effectively, it was an act of corporate terrorism. And over 3,000, 4,000 people died in this explosion. And many more got cancer and so on. It's a really horrible story. About 3 or 4 months later, I didn't read this then. Years later, looking back and trying to actually unravel why this impacted so many of us, because there were 2 events that happened concurrently, Bhopal explosion and the Delhi attack on Sikhs. And since I come from a Sikh family, these things were just hugely traumatic. So I, of course, do what everybody does with that, drop out of college, smoke a lot of marijuana. Because I was completely blown out by, I just couldn't imagine that this is the world that I was supposed to, be studying in college. And 3,000 Sikhs were killed in a weekend. Maybe many more. It's very hard to say. The first time I saw a human being burning to death, somebody throwing petrol on them and then throwing a match. Never seen that before in my life. I hope you don't get a chance to see that in your lives. Horrible experience. But this happened to our generation. That's what we saw, yeah? And so several months later in the New York Times, there was an article reflecting back on what had happened in Bhopal. And I'll never forget this. An American executive who was from a company called American Cynamid made a comment to the New York Times saying, you know, it's terrible, but the Indians have a different idea of life. Their notion of the sanctity of life is different. So when like an Indian dies, they're not as upset as when a European dies. And I remember finding that line 10 years later, maybe. I was in graduate school. You know how I was at the University of Chicago. I was in heaven because the library was, I'd never experienced a library like that. And they had these machines with all the newspapers. I mean, I spent just hours looking for things in the newspapers, had nothing to do with my project. I was like, oh, let me go and explore Bhopal. How did they, you know, out of curiosity, I had notebooks, would fill them up. This line stayed with me. And from about then, in the early 90s, when I went back to India to be a journalist, I really thought about this line a lot. And I started to, in my notebook, keep writing like a crazy person, you know, red rum, The Shining, yeah? Red rum, like a crazy person. I kept working on this idea. There's an international division of labor, and in the scholarly literature, people talk about it. And then there's an international division of humanity. That some people's lives are precious, and other people's lives are expendable. And that they can just die. So that when an Israeli hostage dies, it's so horrible. But when 5,000 Palestinian children just burned to death, you know, they have a different attitude to human life. You know, Muslims, God knows, we don't even know. Are they humans? People, God knows. They have a different attitude. You know, during the tsunami, for instance, in 2005, whatever, somewhere around there, 2006, there was the coastline of Thailand was wiped out, yeah? And there were these like tourists from Europe and so on, and all the newspapers around the world, including the Indian papers, said 6 Germans were killed. There was like 3,000 Thais killed. But who cares? We can't even say their names. Not that I can say any German names either. It's super complicated for me. But the Thai, you know, we don't even, are they human beings? I'm not sure. It's a casual, like when I say this, you're looking and going, come on. Of course, everybody thinks they're human. Not really. In fact, not really. Underneath the politeness of society, there is a careless sense of the international division of humanity. Society is too polite to admit it, you know. It's too polite. Like nobody is going to say, yeah, it's true. Palestinian lives are worth less than... I mean, the Americans have formulas, it seems. 3,000 people die in 9/11, we're just going to kill 30 million people. We're just going to go and carpet bomb Fallujah. And we're just going to bomb Mosul and let 20,000 people die. Or we're just going to destroy Afghanistan, you know. We're just angry. When the dragon is angry, it whips its tail around, yeah? There's no literature in international studies, political science, on the international division of humanity. There's a big literature, not just in labor studies, but in on the international division of labor. But there's an international, I mean, I've felt it since the 1980s. It exists. Fanon's writing is fundamentally about, in my opinion, about the international division of humanity. In Wretched of the Earth, when he starts saying, there's a settler's house, and the settler's house has a garden, and where the settler lives, it's clean. And then where the native lives, there's no garden. Where the native lives, there's running water on the street, sewage. Where the native lives, the children don't know what the sky look like. You know, when Fanon writes that, he's not talking about, it's metaphorical. He's not talking about the settler and the native. He's talking about the international division of humanity. Yesterday morning, I have terrible wake up. I mean, I flew in from Santiago 2 days ago. But still yesterday morning, woke up super early, 5 o'clock, put some clothes on, went for a walk. I took a wrong turn. I didn't go toward the good posh part of town. I went towards Skid Row, And there were all these homeless people, and of course I started talking to all of them. Lots of Maori homeless people, and I thought this is interesting because it's disproportionate Maori. Now maybe you could say that neighborhood, it's different, whatever. People living on the street. A few weeks ago I was at the UN General Assembly and there were all these people on the street in New York. I saw a man with no pants on, and people just walking by, kids going to school. What the hell is that civilization? That's the international division. Like, we're just used to it. We go to Auckland and there's homeless people on the street. It's just there. It's okay. It's a fact of life. We don't even think about it. But that's the international division of humanity. You're stressed about, like, I got to get to my car because where's the parking ticket? You're walking by these three fellows who are just lying passed out on the street with a piece of cardboard on top. Like, what are we doing with our civilization? So the answer to your question, a meandering answer, is that this phrase has stayed with me it actually motivates everything I do. Like, why is it that intelligent people, that people with actually a great deal of civilization, with libraries inside their heads, obviously not literally, but because people don't read anymore, but, lots of information and knowledge in their heads, how is it that we have enabled ourselves to be both morally outraged by certain things and completely accept other things? I mean, there is a genocide happening against the Palestinians. It's actually happening. And we can't stop it. So we get demoralized. So then we let it go. But the fact is, and this is the phrase I learned from my teacher, Ejaz Ahmed. He said, there's a culture of cruelty. That's a phrase he used. So I put together his phrase and international division of humanity. What's a culture of cruelty? He said, you live in a society. He was talking about India. You live in a society where people are quite comfortable having a servant in the house who's there to serve you dinner at your table till 11 at night. And then at 7:30 in the morning, you want a cup of tea from them. And they live either in the house or near the house. You treat a human like that, who has no autonomy and independence in their life, you can then easily tolerate the killing of a Muslim down the street or the humiliation of a Dalit walking down the street stripped naked and so on. You start tolerating things because, in fact, those acts of cruelty are not so different from the culture of cruelty in which you exist. And I think, therefore, that if you live in a society where there is homelessness like this, that culture of cruelty comes to the point where you're inured with violence that is being meted out against the Palestinians. There is a journey for our kind of moral degradation. And I'm saying this because I know a lot of people say, well, why don't you criticize the Chinese and whatever? But, I've traveled a lot in China, in Beijing, in Shanghai. I went there first in the 80s with my mother. There is no homelessness in Shanghai. And people then say, oh, yeah, that's because there's a dictatorship and they take all the people off and throw them in camps. And no, I visited the place where they built housing for people. It's pretty modest housing. But they still got housing. They have a commitment not to let people sleep on the street. So there are parts of the world, in Cuba, for instance, they are under enormous attack for 70 years in a blockade. But the first thing the Cuban Revolution did was try to solve the housing question. You just don't want people to lie half naked on the street. You compare India and China together, and then you think, what's the point of having regular liberal democratic elections? India, half the population is struggling to eat, but they can vote. What the hell is the use of it? So that's the international division of humanity, Mohan. For me, it's an extremely, formative concept, yeah?
So Vijay, one of the questions is, how do you connect this international division of humanity to domestic division of humanity in, say, Aotearoa, Australia, US, where you see, say, massive health inequities that are produced by racial capitalism, colonialism, and their interplays, right? So how do you connect those inequities within to the inequities you see in outcomes outside in international spaces?
Well, first I had an interesting conversation yesterday with somebody who, again, came after me saying, why don't you criticize the Chinese government? Whatever, it's not interesting. He wanted me to say something almost like a litmus test, Like, just say it. Why don't you say it? It's like, I did a debate with a Kenyan ambassador in the UN, and he kept saying to me, why don't you condemn the Russians? And I said, what difference does it make whether I condemn or not? Like, what difference does it make to anything? I want to analyze the situation. My condemnation doesn't change anything. I'm just a useless person with no health insurance. Like, what's the point of me making those statements? You know, it makes no difference. But it's a way to force you into binaries. I like that thing you used a lot, that these are binaries, right? You wrote a response. Very well done. Binaries, where there's no space for a discussion. Yeah, you're already asking somebody, are you or are you not a communist? I don't want to answer the question, you know, etc. It's an interrogative mode. Yeah, so anyway, we were talking, and he said all these Han Chinese going into Xinjiang, you know, settler colonialists, don't you think they should leave? And I asked him, you know, where are you from? Well, my family's from England, so why don't you go home? Why don't you go home? Same logic, settler colonial. Why don't you go home? Okay, 3 generations. So are the Han Chinese, 4 or 5 generations in Xinjiang. At least Xinjiang is right next to the rest of China. England is far away. Why did you come on a boat or a plane? Just go back. You know, you're not needed here. Because, and why I'm saying this, it's an alibi. In order to make yourself feel okay, you criticize somebody else. That China is worse than New Zealand. They are worse. They are conducting things. But here, the Europeans and Maoris, we have a perfect relationship. In fact, we don't mind using a Maori word to refer to ourselves. What's the word? Paha. Huh?
Pakeha.
Pakeha, you know, which is Pakeha, which is like a plurinational country and so on. It's like a fabrication. Yeah? Sorry, I'm being a little rude, but the point I'm trying to make is there's an alibi argument that, look, China is worse and New Zealand is better than China. So in New Zealand, if we're bad to the Maoris or we support the Israeli genocide, well, at least we're not like the Chinese. This is a form of thinking that gives you some peace, you know. You can say, I am an activist to save the Uyghurs in China, but I'm going to do nothing to deal with the question of inequalities in these islands. And I'm going to do nothing to stop a New Zealand naval vessel joining RIMPAC with the Israelis over this summer, not like 20 years ago, this summer. New Zealand Navy joined the Israelis in the largest naval exercise against China called RIMPAC 2024. Yeah, I'm not going to do anything. Because I think the fundamental problem in the world is a problem identified by a right-wing German Christian fundamentalist who has an office next to the CIA and coined the phrase Uyghur genocide. That guy is the believable person who's never been to China, is the person I believe, but I really don't, I can just walk past the homeless Maori man sitting there, I don't really give a shit, walk by, because I'm really going to rescue the Uyghur. That's the way moral superiority and the international division of humanity gets reproduced. Those are people who think they are more radical than you, but in fact, that's a colonial attitude. It's a colonial attitude. They don't want to solve anything in their own society. They are out there championing a cause for which they can't do anything. But it's moral superiority. Because then suddenly they are superior to everybody. And they can yell and scream and say to you that, you know, you're not condemning this, therefore you are a genocide denier. You are the principal genocide denier. You deny the genocide on your own soil where your ancestors participated. My ancestor didn't genocide anybody. We lived near the Khyber Pass. We were the first to meet and greet all the invaders that came to India, from Alexander the Great onwards. Welcome to India. My dad used to say the invaders crossed the Khyber Pass, took a right-hand turn, and that was our village. So we were like, please eat all our food and take everything, pillage.
So Vijay, I'm just looking at the time. I want to ask a question related to this idea of binaries. So is it possible? So I'm just thinking of, say, an activist in Aotearoa that is working around questions of indigenous rights, has heard of concerns around minority rights of Uyghurs in China, and is engaged in standing in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle here. So is there a way to think about connections as a co-constructive, formative form through which one can actually engage in all these conversations, but with the idea of dialogue rather than reproducing binaries?
I mean, you already messed up the question because you said minority rights. And the person who would be like your adversary in this binary would say, why did you say minority rights? It's a genocide. And that what the Uyghurs should have is freedom. And that's an interesting and crazy idea. I had a debate once years ago with somebody who'd never been to Turkey, but was really all the way for Kurdish freedom. And I asked the person, do you know that there's 1 million Kurds who live in Istanbul? So if you're going to create Kurdistan in southwest Turkey, are you going to ask 1 million Kurds to leave Istanbul and go there? Because, for instance, my family was in 1947 living in Lahore, and they had to join the 13 million people who crossed the ridiculous border made by the British and move and lost all their land. And my family didn't have land. They were mostly civil servants, but lost their house, lost everything, and then came to India. I know from our personal history, it's a terrible idea. Like, ethno-nationalist state projects are abysmal and horrible to me. You want to have a complicated society that's plurinational. When I was saying to that young guy, go back to England, I was being facetious. I don't think people should go back to England. I think they should learn to build plurinational societies where the rights of people who are oppressed should be highlighted. Yeah? Independence for the Uyghurs is absurd because there are millions of Uyghurs that live in the rest of China. You walk down the streets in Dali and there's a Uyghur community. So what happens? You're going to have all the Uyghurs go to Uyghur and make like a Uyghur Israel? Do you want the whole planet to become Israel, ethno-nationalist fortress enclaves? That's the last thing I would like. So let's talk about minority rights. Let's talk about what it means to uplift people who are oppressed in different communities. Why not take seriously, for instance, poverty alleviation in China? Because the Chinese government 15 years ago made a public assessment that they had neglected the minorities, the Miao, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and so on. And then they said, we have a go west policy. We are going to eradicate poverty. The last major strongholds of poverty are in the minority communities. I'll give you an example. We did a study in our institute where our team went to many of these places and documented how the Chinese project was able to abolish absolute poverty. There's a village that they went to where the people lived on a cliff face. And by ropes, the kids used to go to school. And many of them used to die because the ropes would break. And on the ropes, they had put like nice decorations, and there was a National Geographic story which completely romanticized this whole thing. You know, they treat us sometimes like we are animals in a zoo. You know, oh, look at these cute people in caves. We are not Ewoks. We want to live in the world, man. We don't want children to fall down, plummet to their death, even though there's beautiful, you know, designs on the ropes, yeah? So what the Chinese Communist Party in this case, activists went and said, look, we built houses down here. You can come and take the houses and live there, or you can stay there and it's dangerous. And there are all kinds of benefits we'll give you if you come here. Huge carrot, including teaching people digital, how to use, you know, whatever computer. People left. They came and lived in the building. Now, I remember reading about this before we did our study where some people in the West were saying this is a form of cultural genocide, that they were erasing the culture of these people. What the hell, man? I mean, this is really zoological. Like, primitive people should live in very difficult situations. Women are getting emphysema because in the caves along the hillside, they are lighting fires inside and cooking and getting lung cancer. So because we like to see people, when on tourism, living in these bloody little caves, and that somehow is a nice photo opportunity, they should continue to live there and die of lung cancer. And if you actually offer them housing, that's cultural genocide. I was so offended by that attitude to actual living people. That super offends me. That's a form of that journal. Remember cultural survival? I just despise that form of anthropology because it treats people like they are in a zoo. And it's unforgivable to treat humans like that. We live with political, economic, social advances in front of us all the time. One of the greatest Marxist thinkers on this was Jose Carlos Mariátegui from Peru, who wrote a book in 1928 called 7 Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality, where he talked about the indigenous people of Peru. And he said, for us, this is 1928, for us the past is not a destination. We don't want to go to the past. For us the past is a resource. We don't want the modernist way of just breaking ties with the past. We want a link to the past. But for us the past isn't a destination. We don't want to go back to the past. We don't want to live without the internet and so on. And of course the most frustrating thing about this debate is the people who make these cultural survival arguments all live in houses with air conditioning and computers and but they want the savages to continue living in their loincloth. And I find that, and I know I sound like a modernizer, whatever, but I find that super objectionable and racist. It's not in fact pro those people. It's a racist international division of humanity way of seeing the world. I'm going to have my air conditioner, but you can sit there with a palm leaf.
So what you're really critiquing, Vijay, in this sense is cultural essentialist tropes that fix culture in the past and then articulate projects of resistance with these fixed ideas of the past, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, somehow a person in the cave says we're not moving, they become a hero. I mean, nobody says they have to move. You stay there, but that's not heroic. Talk to 2 generations later, where's the heroism? Now, that doesn't mean I'm like, let's erase, nature and build freeways, okay? I'm with that Joni Mitchell song, pave paradise and make a parking lot. It's okay, Joni, I mean, I agree with you. Paradise can remain. And I hate cars. But can we have like high-speed rail and you don't have to pave the whole thing, just a little high-speed rail and you can have your flowers and so on and then, I mean, I flew here on a plane. Yeah, it was a strange experience because there was no security check. I felt I was like in 1965. I just walked onto the plane. I haven't had that experience since I flew to Libya with my dad in 1974 or something. Just walk onto the plane and in fact, that plane we took was a propeller plane that flew from Bombay to Cairo, but it kept stopping. Yeah, like a bus, picking up people. And in those days, people weren't always dressed in the same. So landed in Manama, Bahrain, and there was a tent airport, and so on. Fantastic experiences, yeah? But we were living in a different, we're in a different period where technology plays a big role in our lives. And technology is liberating. It's also hugely destructive of parts of, human and natural existence. But it's also liberating. And I think, again, to have a binary between modern and traditional, technology and no technology, native and the superior, all of these things make no sense to me. Like, why does it have to be a choice between, having whatever, a mobile phone and smoke signals? It's not a choice. Yeah, you can do both things. You can have your traditions and cultures which are reformed and look at it, the right wing fully is aware of this. The right is quite happy to, I remember once in Delhi in the 1980s, lived in Nizamuddin, there was a big giant temple down the street. They'd already started valet parking. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. It's a temple with valet parking. That was in the 90s. Now they must have like an underground parking garage, and I don't keep up with the modernization of temple culture, but it's incredible. There was another temple I visited, I was interested in the temple complex in Madurai. This is again in the 90s. There were 3 lines to go see the god, yeah? One was the normal fare, then there's the second, you pay a little more and you get kind of close, and then there's a VIP line, where you pay a lot of money and you get to go right up to the idol. Capitalism was right there with them. Yeah, they don't maintain some traditional. They are advancing all the time.
So I want to pick on that, Vijay, because I want to jump to the Indian context and the sort of build on this. So what's been happening in India, in my analysis, seems that the right or the fascist right has co-opted the language of decolonization and cultural tradition precisely within these architectures of formulating a particular kind of modernity to push forth a reactionary project. So I wanted to ask, what are the pitfalls of the language of decolonization that don't engage with these kinds of critique that look at the reactionary turn of culture?
Yeah, so that's why the Mobutu story is a prefiguration of what happens later in India, right? He changes his name to Mobutu Seko Sese, but then he says multinationals come and pillage our economy. So in India, the hard right comes in and they say there's, you know, I used to walk down the street where there was a big building and it said Planning Commission. It was one of the most important buildings in the Indian government. You know, in the road that goes to VP House, the Planning Commission, yeah? So the BJP government comes in and they change the sign. And they shut down the Planning Commission. They call it Niti Ayog. So first they give a Sanskritic name to it, and then they say, we're not going to plan anymore. We're sort of going to do some astrological forecasting. So in the name of tradition, they basically hand over management of the economy to the private sector. How is this tradition? This is basically IMF policy. So, but they've given IMF policy a Sanskrit name, Niti Ayog. How is this better? Like, what is this? Yeah? I mean, the Planning Commission, okay, it was an English name. Yeah? Thanks, Britain, for colonizing us. Useless country. I mean, how did that tiny little island manage this, you know, with pathetic food habits and, you know, terrible dentistry, and they just came and took over so much of the world. It's appalling, you know. So till now I'm puzzled. I was asking Jeremy Corbyn a few months ago, like, how did your ancestors do it? And he was like, not my ancestors. I was like, maybe, who knows? Yeah, but you know, it was an English name, but the whole structure of the Planning Commission was developed by Indians. Like P.C. Mahalan was the great statistician who developed the entire project of planning. So in that sense, it was a decolonial, to use a word I hate, it was a decolonial project. Just by changing the name to Sanskrit doesn't make it decolonial. There's a way in which decolonial also has become nuts. Like people think, oh, I'm writing in Hindi, so I'm decolonial. Are you crazy? The whole Hindu right writes in Hindi. How is that decolonial? And they are writing in Hindi saying, let's open the economy up. Yeah, that doesn't make it decolonial. You're not challenging the structures of power. You're just speaking a different language and it's not liberating. Okay, I also write in Hindi. How does that change anything? Suddenly I'm not superior because I can write, right? It's dumb, you know, in my opinion.
So I love how you come back to this question of structures.
Yeah.
And the little bit of time I have before we open up the space to questions, I want to go back to the generative notion of a title, which was Third World Futures. Yeah. So you sort of gave us a flashback of the history in terms of the Third World Project, and then how then it was in some ways annihilated through Atlantic interventionism, right? Now we are in 2024. Is the Third World Project reconfigured in the form of BRICS? What do you think of BRICS, and what are the possibilities it offers?
I mean, I'm not I don't think we're in the point where you make an announcement. I think that when the US financial crisis happened, in our institute, we did a calculation and said this is the third Great Depression in the North Atlantic world, and its subsidiary economies down here and so on. We are in the third Great Depression. The first one was triggered in 1893. It lasted for a pretty short period of time. Second one, 1929. Third one, 2007. And in fact, the capitalist economies haven't recovered from the third Great Depression. You're still in it. I mean, New Zealand is actually still in a depression. Even though the technical definition of depression is technically devised by the economists to prevent talking about it as depression, because you have to have the rate of growth has to decline over 3 quarters. So if the rate of growth is near 0, it's not going to decline over 3 quarters, it's just sitting at 0. So you say it's not a depression because the rate of growth hasn't declined, but it's just sitting near 0. So how is that not a depression? It's just that you've developed a way to define it out of being allowed to call it a depression. This is the third Great Depression. China, India, Indonesia, all these countries figured out we can't rely on the Western market anymore as the market of last resort. Like, they are not going to be able to absorb our goods. So from 2009, 10, 11, they started discussing we have to create so-called South-South economies. We have to have new commercial linkages. And in 2009, when BRICS first meets, it meets basically to discuss what is the possibility of inter-large economy trade in the South. Can China trade more with South Africa and the African continent, or with Latin America and so on? So that's the initial part. If you look at the BRICS early summits, they're all about commerce and trade. There was some discussion about the BRICS visa, BRICS intellectual and academic. That was all for sure. The main thing was, can we sell things to each other? Because we can't sell to the US market. The Chinese then start the Belt and Road Initiative, initially One Belt, One Road. That was to try to get their goods away from the US market, first to Central Asia, then to East Asia, West Asia, eventually Africa, India, Latin America, the whole world, Europe and so on. But all of that was premised on the theory that the United States is finished. So how do you go forward? But they are in a long process of constructing these alternatives. I mean, the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank in Shanghai, has money, but nobody really yet has faith in it. Dilma Rousseff is the president. At Tricontinental, we have more economists than they do. It's a really small operation. So it's not yet moved as it could. The contingency reserve agreement or arrangement, which is the alternative to the IMF short-term funding, they really haven't given money to anybody yet. People are not going to the CRA, they are going to the IMF. So it's not really taken off yet. It's going to take time. BRICS met in Kazan. In Kazan, it's very interesting, is it's modulated India's politics, for instance. India, Modi talked to Putin and said, India wants to mediate to bring peace in Ukraine because the West is useless. It's not going to do it. He's actually said that. He said, they cannot do it, we can do it. That has actually modulated India. India has not supported Israel in this genocide. India continues to insist on the two-state solution, which is completely different than Netanyahu's position. Yeah, and that's because India is modulated by the BRICS and the revival of NAM. So things are happening. In our institute, we say there's a new mood in the global South. But I'm not keen on saying there's multipolarity or this or that, because nothing has really happened yet. It's people anticipating beyond the facts. And I'm a huge believer in you build theory from the facts. You don't build theory from illusions and aspirations. Aspirations are important and should be part of your overall understanding of your analysis. But you can't build a theory from aspirations. You can anticipate with aspirations, but your theory has to be built from the facts. There is no multipolarity today. It's actually irresponsible to say there is. Because then the next thing you say is that there is a conflict between China and the United States. There is no conflict between China and the United States. The United States is imposing a conflict on China. The Chinese do not want a conflict. They don't want to go to war. The Chinese want to trade. But the United States doesn't want China to develop, because they fear this is an existential threat to their economy. If the Chinese actually were allowed to trade phones, if you go to India or you go to, India is a great example of this. People don't have iPhones. iPhone is way too expensive. People have South Korean phones and Chinese phones. African continent, it's all Chinese phones. And it's not Huawei, it's like Honor and all kinds of other brands that you may not know about. Yeah? It's all Chinese phones. Apple cannot compete. What the Yanks want is they want China to be the workers of US companies, not for Chinese companies to come in. So they want China to de-develop. So they are imposing a conflict on the Chinese. This is not a Chinese conflict with the US. That's a very ideological way to approach it. Yeah? So if you see all that, there is a lot of churning and shifting going on. I have some material if people are interested. We did a text last January called The Churning of the World Order. We believe that great Vedic term of churning, churning of the oceans, and the serpent arises and so on. I love the word churning, yeah? The churning of the butter, Krishna's butter and so on. This word is brilliant because it captures the unsettled nature of international relations. People say, well, why don't these countries stop the genocide in Palestine? The United States has a military blockade on the Eastern Mediterranean. There are carrier groups sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there are 43,000 US troops in the vicinity of Israel. There's a carrier group in the Gulf. If any ship tries to break that blockade, they're going to have to come in some sort of conflict with the US. You can't send like a Chinese vessel. Imagine a Chinese vessel tries to go to Gaza. They're going to have to go past a US blockade. I don't want them to try. I want the genocide to end. But I don't want the genocide to then lead to a shooting match between China and the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a nightmare, okay? And I got to tell you that you live in New Zealand, it's a perfect shape like an aircraft carrier, and your government is increasingly making your country into an aircraft carrier for the Americans. And I'm telling you, you don't want that. You don't want to be a frontline state in a war between two nuclear powers. It's a really bad idea. I would recommend you to go back to old Switzerland, before Switzerland entered the conflict against the Russians. Just be a neutral country. What's wrong with that? Grow, sheep and computer engineers and whatever. Just don't allow yourselves to become an aircraft carrier. I'm begging you. It's really bad for your grandchildren.
So one last question, Vijay, and that is related to justice. You talked about military economics. Now, one of the things we have seen with the current genocidal campaign is the Global South raising claims to justice through International Criminal Court and spaces like that, and yet it seems that that isn't enough to stop the genocide. So what is the project of the Global South in terms of envisioning spaces for global justice? Yeah,
so we did a big text last January called HyperImperialism. You can get all these for free off the website, thetricontinental.org. And in that text, we actually did a very, I think, good calculation of world military spending. SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute's numbers are not good because they, for instance, with the US spending, they don't look at the US Energy Department, which is where most of the nuclear spending happens. So if you don't add that in, the US military is lots of nuclear. You've got to add some of that money. So we did a really good audit and did new numbers, and we showed that of the 2.4 trillion world spent, US is 1.53 trillion. It's overwhelmingly the largest. But US plus NATO countries is 74% of world military spending. China is 10%. Russia is 4%. And yet, all the media, you'd think Russia and China are like the greatest threats to the planet Earth. Combined military spend 14%, essentially defensive powers. United States 74% of world military spending with its NATO allies. That's an obscene amount of military spending, okay? That's why the US infrastructure is crumbling. They just don't have money to spend on things. Okay, I can see the point that you're making, because the point is that as a consequence of these new centers of economic growth, India, Indonesia, China, and so on, countries like Namibia aren't scared of speaking their mind because they're not reliant on IMF support for getting funding. They can go to the People's Bank of China, they can go to the Reserve Bank of India. There are other places where they can find finance. So they have much more freedom to speak their mind. That's what's happening in this period. Bolivia knows that it doesn't get a good deal from the IMF. They don't care if they piss the Americans off. They're going to get funding from the People's Bank of China. They'll get currency swaps, all kinds of things. So they speak their mind. They go to the ICJ and say, we support the South African case. That's over there. But then, why aren't they able to prevail? And that's because you still have a country and a military project that has 900 military bases around the world. Okay? 900 military bases around the world. I'm going to Australia next. Tyndall Air Base being expanded so that the United States can bring B-52 bombers, nuclear capable, to land them in northern Australia and Darwin, within striking distance of the Chinese landmass. B-52 bombers with nuclear weapons. Violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga. Chinese are scared. China is afraid that if the United States put missiles in Taiwan, that's 11 minutes flight time to Beijing. There's no way to defend against that. Mid-range missile. It's not the Chinese that left the intermediate nuclear treaty. It's Trump in 2019. It's Bush that unilaterally walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. All of this stuff scares the Russians and Chinese. They think now the Germans are building a military base in Lithuania. 4,000 German troops are going to be based there on the Russian border. If they put a missile there, it's about 9 minutes flying time to Moscow. You know, the Russians aren't building a base in Mexico. Chinese are not building a base in Cuba. This is not the Russian missile crisis. This is the NATO missile crisis. And they are provoking these countries into war. And we don't want that. I am against war fundamentally. But because these countries are so powerful militarily, you don't want to directly confront them. Iran fired those missiles into Israel, but they only struck military bases. They do not want to enter a confrontation with the US. US cannot win a war. It was defeated by the Taliban, but they can destroy countries from the air. They can bomb Tehran to rubble. If they land troops, they won't win. But that doesn't mean they can't just destroy cities in Iran. The Iranians say this publicly. They do not want that. United States is a very dangerous power. For good reason, Chomsky said it is the most dangerous country in the world. It sounds crazy because you think the most dangerous country is North Korea. Because, you know, Kim Jong-un is like some crazy guy who's got a nutty sister. But Biden is completely fine. Nice man, white guy. Yeah? This is totally nice guy. Olaf Scholz, nice guy. Your, Prime Minister, what's his name? Lucas, what the hell, David Seymour. All these sock puppet, useless people. Yeah, they're all just nice guys with, this is the international division of humanity. There's some crazy Korean fellow is nuts. Saddam Hussein was nuts. Saddam Hussein suddenly becomes this nut. Listen, I'm not carrying water for him. But suddenly he's like this terrible guy who gassed the Kurds. Who gave you the gas to use on the Kurds? It was the Federal Republic of Germany, the West Germans. It was the United States. Donald Rumsfeld goes to Baghdad, cuts a deal with Saddam. They provide the materials for mustard gas so that the Iraqis could use it against the Iranians. My friend and colleague, now dead, Robert Fisk, was on a train, Iranian troop train going back, saying he ran up and down the corridor of the train, opening windows, because as the sick soldiers were coughing, mustard gas was coming out of their lungs. And that's why they tried to ventilate the train. Yeah, that was US and German provided weaponry to Iraq to use against the Iranians, which then Saddam turns around and uses in the Anfal campaign against the Kurds. But Saddam is the evil one, not the West Germans and the United States. George Bush obliterates Iraq. He's not the evil one. No ICC warrant for him. International division of humanity. People are scared of the United States. You are not, because you are in the San Francisco Treaty. But other countries are scared that they will just come and bomb us. And, well, there's no evidence for that because they are a country that believes in the international rules-based order and so on. I wrote a book about this called Washington Bullets, just detailed all the attempts to destabilize countries using CIA material. I wanted to write a book about the murder of a US ambassador in Kabul. The former director of West Asia of the CIA invited me for tea. I was living in Beirut. He asked me to fly to Boston. I went to see him. And he told me all these stories, and then he tells me, don't stop looking at who killed Dubs. I was like, why should I stop? He said, it's good for your health. That's what these guys are like. They're like the mafia. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not like a paranoid freak. This is how they are. They are the ones who bombed Iraq illegally. No UN Security Council resolution, lied to the UN. And yet, after Colin Powell lies to the UN, you still think the Americans are reasonable and that Harris is better than Trump. You still think that. You still think Obama is a good guy. Obama sanctioned the assassination of people by drone, including at least 2 US citizens, with no judicial finding. And one of those US citizens, one was Anwar al-Awlaki, who's an adult, assassinated in Yemen, and then his 16-year-old son in a separate drone strike. Actually, that was a missile strike. Separate missile strike, they targeted this 16-year-old boy drinking a soft drink with his cousin in Yemen. Why did they kill a 16-year-old boy assassinated at Obama's orders? No judicial oversight. And yet you say, well, he's a cool guy, I want to know, what's Obama's end of the year book list? And his music taste, and he's cool. He's an assassin. But he's not the assassin. Bin Laden is the assassin. Bin Laden is bad, but these guys are not any better.
So Vijay, as we wrap up, you leave me with a critical question, which is sort of the limits of liberal, racial, multiculturalism when you bring an anti-imperial analysis to it. And with that, I would love to open up the floor to maybe just a couple of questions. We have a mic there if you raise your hand. And
well, that's easy. Oh, well, some there, yeah. Well.
No, there is a mic
one,
going.
Yeah,
so,
there was
yeah,
one
go ahead,
behind you as well.
Kia ora, thank you for a very enlightening talk today. I'm Te Awatea Ward, Akona Māori Literacy Support person here and President of the Tertiary Education Union. On a day-to-day small level, how can we stop the binaries and open our eyes to the level of bullshit that's happening, my words, not yours, around at the moment? Because reading between the lines, I'm thinking, hey, we need to take care of here, what's in our power to take care of, and step it up from there. But your insights around day-to-day activities and actions would be much gratefully received. Thank you.
Fantastic question. You want to take a few questions, or?
Sure. Can we take the 3
Yeah,
questions?
there was one there and then one
Oscar
here.
and then Shrikant.
Yeah.
I'll be the last reporter.
No.
Oscar, right there, Oscar.
Oh, okay.
Hi, kia ora, Vijay. Namaskara.
Oscar.
I'm Oscar, part of an activist group called Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians. Yeah, my question was, you were talking about how Indian government's position is not aligning with Netanyahu's position on genocide, but at the same time we are also seeing explosives being shipped to Israel from India, and drones manufactured have been, given to Israel, and also India being part of BRICS, an integral part of the BRICS at the same time, engaging in Quad with the Australia, Japan, and United States, which I personally I feel it's a Gunda gang to contain China in the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, and these nuances, how this works, overly increasing right-wing government, and again the I2U2 group where India engages with Israel and continuously abstaining from UN resolutions, calling to end the settler colonialism in Palestine. How do you see these differences? Is it the more right-wing the government in India and more aligning with the US foreign policy?
Shall we take one more question?
One more, please, yeah.
I found your talk extensive but rambling. You touched on a lot of things without offering any kind of hope or solution or anything. A couple of factual points. You praised China for lifting a large number of people out of poverty, which is true, as did India. But at the same time, you said the people who say that this was bliss when they're climbing to school, tending a rope, why do you condemn them when they choose their house? Maori, accordingly, would say that we had our country here, we grew kumra, we survived, we were navigating people. You come, you say you civilize us, give us this, that, and the other thing. When we complain, you said, what the hell? So the same comparison. Maori might say that we did not need Europeans to civilize us. We are happy with our own conditions. You are saying, I thought, that because you've given us these various civilizational artifacts, you should be grateful. I disagree with that. And another factual thing, you mentioned China. I've been to China and traveled extensively. I've seen poverty in the streets of Shanghai and Beijing, not comparable with the affluence of others around them. And the entire population was moved away to build new Shanghai. So it's not as though they tolerate people doing what they do. So that's factual. One other substantive point, you mentioned, I like that phrase of yours, I'm familiar with that, international division of humanity. Long before the colonial end started ending, which I would say in 1947 when India became independent, one personality then and one slightly afterwards, Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, their struggles were exactly to establish international humanity and common humanity among people. Mahatma Gandhi pointed out that British could not rule India without the active collaboration of Indians. So desist collaborating, fight in a way that you find dignified, you gain your dignity, not by surrendering to them. Nelson Mandela, accordingly, slightly later in the 1960s maybe, he also said the same thing, that we cannot have both you ruling over us and condemning us for being what you are, so give us our own dignity, so we'll gain it by doing it. So I'll point out to you that.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I mean, I would like to apologize for rambling, but that's the nature of a conversation. It wasn't really a talk. It's very difficult to have a sustained, conceptually driven talk when we're having a conversation. So, yeah, I mean, it's a form. It's not a disability, it's a form. Okay, so let's first think about India. We often do this to countries. We say India, China is doing this, United States is doing that, and so on. These are complicated entities. What I was referring to is the fact that the Indian government never said, we support what's happening, what Israel is doing. And that is an enormous difference than 2014, when India refused to condemn what was happening. I was in Gaza in 2014. We were waiting for some statement to come from the NAM, and it seemed like India was trying to block a statement. That didn't happen this time. And interestingly, India has several times, that is, Jaishankar has several times, the foreign minister, external affairs minister, several times said, we believe in the two-state solution, which in a way is to prevent a shield against the annexation of Gaza. So in that sense, there's a slight difference. That's why I meant modulating. That doesn't mean that the Indian government then said, we're going to prevent licenses for private companies to export drones to Israel. Because that's not the Indian government exporting it. It's private companies in India that are selling it. The Indian government didn't stop the licenses. But the Indian Dockers Union said that we will not load the ships. So that's why it's actually important to disarticulate India If you keep saying India did this, India did that, different parts of India were doing different things. The Dockers Union said, we're not going to load the ships. So for a long time, nothing went to Israel. That's still the position of the Dockers Union. Yeah, it's the largest Dockers Union in India. Not all Dockers are in the union, but it's the largest union. So it's actually in a flux and in a complexity. India is no longer actually a central part of the Quad. In fact, the United States has given up on India. They've created a new body with Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. It's a new Quad. India is not part of that. And the I2U2 has died out since October 7th. I2U2 was created to build the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. But after October 7th, the Saudis could not permit. And by the way, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor is the Adani corridor. Because Adani owns the port in Gujarat. He has a part stake in the port in Dubai. He owns the Haifa port in Israel. And he owns 2 ports in Greece. This whole corridor was Adani. But October 7th has put that at least on deep freeze. So actually things are in flux. One has to keep up with these things. It's true that there was I2U2. That is India, Israel, United States, and the UAE. That's the I2U2. But that's on deep freeze. And really the Quad is dying out. It's now the Philippines. It's much more aggressive power than India could have been. And the fact that India and China in the lead up to the BRICS summit in Kazan agreed to the border post delimitation shows you that there are things happening that are not quite clear. Listen, I am person non grata with the Indian government. I have no water to carry for them. But I'm still somebody who believes in the facts. I read Jaishankar's statements, I take seriously what they are saying, and so on. We need to have a factual understanding of what the Indian government is up to. Yeah? Otherwise we'll get into, like, the right-wing government is horrible, but one has to still see what are the things in motion. So I very much believe that, like, when you said all those things about I2U2, in fact, it's not exactly permanently like that. It might return. If there's a ceasefire, it might return. Because Adani will make a lot of money with this corridor. Yeah, it's a big thing. I don't want to argue with you about Shanghai and poverty. You're entitled to your opinion. That's okay. It's actually quite useless for us to go back and forth. And I don't want to do that. But broadly speaking, I think that the question is, how does one relate to something like the Chinese Revolution or the Chinese experience? China exists in Asia. It is the largest economy in the world if you look at PPP. Countries...
No, in the USA, China is not...
Okay, it's the second largest. It doesn't matter. This is not like a earth-shattering difference. So I actually think if you look at the PPP, it's larger than it, but it doesn't matter. Okay, it's the second largest. It's not important. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is there are lots of countries in Asia whose first trading partner is China, including New Zealand. So isn't it better if we start having a better understanding of what's happening there, build a collaboration around, things that are in common, then hasten confrontations? Yeah, that's the basic point. I mean, if New Zealand was so confirmed in its view that China is the diabolical part of the world, then stop trading with the Chinese. Let your economy go into a recession. No, I know that. I'm saying, but I don't want to get into a back and forth. I'm just making a hypothetical point. Yeah, if Australia wants to do this, or if Taiwan wants to stop trading with the Chinese. Nobody's forcing you. But the fact is that countries are. India is increasingly going to become one of China's major trading partners. Their trade is increasing. Yeah, this is a reality. It is an enormous economy. They have developed technologies that we should be importing, actually, including telecommunications material, towers and things for 5G, 6G, and so on. We need more collaboration. That's the basic point. And it's funny, the space to have that conversation is deeply limited about more collaboration, less confrontation. It's a very simple, seems to me a commonsensical slogan. Nobody's talking about don't have the space to criticize other countries. But what are you criticizing them for? Are you criticizing them to be morally superior or to help people change things? I think that comes to the point. And that comes right to the question you asked about scales of activism. See, because I very much believe in that culture of cruelty theory, that small acts of cruelty allow you to then, do big acts of cruelty. It makes a big difference if your local member of parliament stands up in the parliament and criticizes, let's say, New Zealand sending a ship to RIMPAC 2024. But the only reason that member of parliament is going to do that if there's a constituency that has been doing something in the world to change the cruelty in the world. You got to build a less cruel society to have a less cruel foreign policy. You can't have a less cruel foreign policy and a cruel society. I don't believe it works like that. I think a cruel society ends up producing a callous, cruel foreign policy. These things are intimately related. So for instance, I think if I lived in this country, I would be involved in the campaign to make sure nobody sleeps on the street. I would say that and ending hunger is absolutely fun. Like I would not. I live in Santiago in Chile, and I got to say that even in a commune where I live, the anti-homelessness problem is extremely deep in the political forces. It's not an anti-homeless problem. Many countries, like when I was growing up in India, there was an anti-poor people problem. So like Indira Gandhi announced this program called Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. But in fact, it became Garib Delhi Se Hatao, which is that evict the poor from Delhi and send them to these colonies outside the city. That's not an anti-poverty campaign. That's an anti-poor people campaign. And I think the gap between the two is interesting. In a place like Chile, from the time of Allende's government, over 50 years ago, the idea that you got to get nutrition to poor children, the milk program, you got to get food to people. Children going to school must be fed, before. So you got to have breakfast. How are you going to get them? In communities, not in the school. Children shouldn't go to school and the poor kids go to eat breakfast and the richer kids go to, the library. That's humiliating. So they eat breakfast in the community. These things were well thought out. It's not bloody rocket science. We just got to return to our own humanity and build these things in our community. The less cruel society, the less cruel the foreign policy. I just believe that axiomatically. You can prove me wrong, and I'll be happy to be proved wrong, but I just feel that Ejaz's culture of cruelty theory has really impacted this approach that I want to share with you. That if you allow small acts of cruelty, if you allow yourself to be rude to people, the small rudenesses, they escalate in your own personality and you become a rude person in general. If you try to be kind in the smallest interactions, you will become a kinder person. It's not rooted in your... I always tell my kids that, all the girls, I always say, you got to be kind in the smallest acts that you have. Because if you get into the habit of being rude, you become rude. Rudeness is not a character flaw. You got to cultivate kindness in the small things. It's a culture of cruelty. And I think I'm sorry to take a methodological, individualistic example to explain a social problem, but I really do believe that this is, for me, axiomatic. And again, you're welcome not to agree with me and just go and be rude people. And that's up to you, but I don't recommend it. Yeah.
Can we have just a couple of questions, because we are already way past time. I know that there were a couple of hands here and I want to respect that. Yeah.
I have a couple of observations and not really a question. I'm still trying to think it through. So the observation, your mention of Biden as this nice old guy, but I don't think one should forget that as a young man, he met Netanyahu while the Lebanon war was on and said, you should have finished the job, not let the women and children live. I'd have got them all out. So what's happening now is, with the full consent of Biden, what he couldn't do as a young man, he's finishing the job as an old man before he leaves office. So that's the one observation. I really liked how you talked about the churning, and I also appreciated that juncture historically with Lubumba, Thomas Sankara, and the kinds of, and that moment of possibilities that that signifies that juncture. So they tried to leave legacies, and there are genealogies for how they came to be doing what they are. So with Thomas Sankara, he had a close collaboration with Paulo Freire. It was all about educating people, a new curriculum for a new world and a new life. I feel at this juncture there's a churning, but the churning that is happening is among the young of the world, that those who have a grip on power are not actually fully discerning. Are you able to read the tea leaves of where the young people are going? Because it is quite different and contrary to our generation and older. There is a churning on. And this churning also has genealogies, but what legacies can it then portend?
Perhaps just one more question, if there is any.
Hi, I just wanted to ask how, like, you mentioned the sovereign debt crisis previously in your talk, and I know you didn't exactly want to get into it. How do you stay positive or see a positive vision for, you know, a kind of, shall we say, return from the debt of the third world in a world where, of course, you know, nations, especially now, are having so much difficulty financing their own debt, in a world where exogenous shocks like climate change are making it more and more difficult? How do you stay positive and kind of see the potential for this to occur, in a sense?
Short answer is, for both of these questions, please follow the work of the institute I direct, because we produce a lot of material answering all these questions. But I'm going to give you an answer now, but please follow our material, because we have researchers who come out of political movements, in research departments of social movements, and they work in teams to produce this research. Because we have a theory that those who are trying to change the world best understand it. That's our motto. And so we have people in these movements producing the research that then we publish. So please read the stuff. Let me start with your question, because it's the more direct one to answer. We're doing a study with the Senegalese, because the Senegalese government is a new progressive government. But they are struggling with, where do we raise financing for development that is not merely servicing our debt, which is a classic question of all the new relatively progressive governments. The Senegalese, one of the ministers that I met said to me, we want to create an agenda which puts the Senegalese first, not the Western bondholders first. How do we do it? Well, so we started off, we haven't finished the work, but we looked at the numbers, the data in Senegal. And one of the things I was interested in, about 16% of the external revenue comes from gold. So immediately our team was like, okay, let's just take a look at this. So I don't know if you know this, but every morning, about 8 men go into a room in London, and they close the door, and at the spot of, I think it's like 9:18 or some esoteric weird English tradition, they announce the gold price for the day. That's how the gold prices are set. These guys are the gold board. It's a weird thing, okay? There's no market. These guys set the gold price for the day. The interesting thing is, the spot price at the mines in Senegal are at variance with the gold price in London. So there's a gap between the official gold board price and the spot price at the mine. So that variance is itself billions of dollars. So this is what we are trying to calculate, make an index of plunder. How much is Senegal losing now per day to multinational corporations? And I think our rough envelope number is that it's about double the external debt. So the plunder of these countries is extraordinary. And this is just the plunder based on variance of pricing. Then there's transfer mispricing, or what's called transfer pricing, which is the legalization of accounting fraud. So that a company is operating in Senegal, and they have a branch in Uganda, and they expense the branch overseas, so that then they have to cover that in their bills. So they basically extract profit to another place saying, we had a service contract. It's within the same company. This is a complete fraud. I mean, there's like 100, the Basel II process produced reports on this, but nobody acted on it. The big three accounting companies are really powerful. You know, they're really, really powerful. They have a lock on this. We don't look at accounting firms. You think multinationals, right? But the accounting firms are really corrupt. This is corruption. Me paying you a bribe is not corruption. That's some petty shit. This is serious billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of theft. So the question of how do you finance for development, it's actually not that difficult. The problem is the neo-colonial structure. Dongo Samba Silla, who is working with us on this, wrote a fantastic book called The Last Colonial Currency, which is about the CFA franc. The so-called francophone, they're not really francophone countries. The main language in Senegal is not French, it's Wolof. But the so-called francophone countries keep their external reserves in the central bank in France, in francs. What's the currency of France? It's the euro. And yet, these countries are using a CFA franc. It's insane. The way plunder is structured and invisible is insane. So it's actually not true that there are no resources. The Congo has $22 trillion of resources, but it controls almost none of it. You know, the biggest plunderers are companies like Glencore, based in Switzerland, which was founded by Mark Rich, who was a fugitive from US justice, pardoned by Bill Clinton. He was a criminal, but his mining company is domiciled in Switzerland. It eats the Congo. That company is like the Belgian crown. It's completely invisible, you know. People say, oh, you know, Africa's a mess. Oh, really? Really? When you said, you know, Sankara legacies, Ibrahim Traoré, who's now the head of government in Burkina Faso, is a Sankaraist. He dresses like Sankara, he talks like Sankara, he's trying to do the best like Sankara, but one half of his country is occupied by Al-Qaeda. So the first task is how do you establish territorial sovereignty? And there are people around the world saying he's a military dictator. If he's a military dictator, so was Sankara. You can't put up a poster of Sankara on your social media and lionize him and then say Ibrahim Traoré is a military dictator. Sankara would spit on your face. Those legacies exist. You know, I travel in the Congo, people have pictures of Lumumba in their homes. Those legacies don't die out. The question is, who is capable of assembling the legacy into a political project? Joseph Kabila utilized Lumumba, but he didn't put it into a project. He was not sincere. Ibrahim Traoré is sincere. He is a Sankaraist, but it's a landlocked country. In the 1990s, I interviewed Alpha Omar Konaré, who was the head of president of Mali. Konaré, who used to be a Marxist and then was a liberal, he said to me, if the Americans allow us to get a debt haircut, I can solve the problem of the Tuareg, you know, the central Mali problems, all that stuff. But the United States government, the head of African Affairs in the State Department said, no, you have debts to fulfill. You cannot, you have to pay your debt. Really? All these American companies go broke, you bail them out? Here's a Malian liberal guy saying, I want to solve sincerely, and it's a Clinton administration. Anthony Lake, I think, was the guy for African Affairs, said, no, sorry. Yeah, people say sometimes to me, oh, you know, you're obsessed with the Americans. Really, I think the Americans are obsessed with dominating the world. It's not my obsession. I don't want to think about it. Everywhere you go, they seem to be poking their fingers, you know. So I also don't believe that it's the youth. You know, the youth is also a category that we need to open up and look at. There are lots of older people interested in making the world better. It has to do with what are your commitments. And many places, young people are actually quite reactionary in their ambitions and thinkings, and they have been absorbed, grown up and absorbed into neoliberal entrepreneurial thinking. So I don't think that, you know, it's generations by themselves are too abstract to make change. It's what is the political project before people? Are they able to step outside their cultural formation? These are huge challenges in the world, because the cultures we have inherited are not radical cultures. They are generally conformist, you know, family, nepotistic in, you know, I mean nepotistic in the abstract way. Our cultures are deeply, you worry about your kids, they are the primary thing, your cousins, and you know, like there's no culture in the world that is social in its composition. That's a struggle for people to think. You know, the family-oriented advancement was okay 300-400 years ago, when our technology and our sense of connection was lower. But now we live in a much different world where something happening here impacts somewhere far away. So our consciousness of human community has to expand. And I think we're sort of lagging in that. We still think family, maybe neighborhood. These way of seeing the world was okay for a previous state of our productive forces. But as the productive forces have expanded so dramatically, communications, technology, and so on, we have to also expand our idea of what is our community. Is it my family and my kids first? Or is it, you know, the world? And I think that is a huge challenge. You want hope, but hope has to be grounded in the realities of the world. It has to be able to drive and expand our imagination. It can't be an abstraction. You know, I learned that from the great Ernst Bloch, who wrote a terrific 3-volume book called Principles of Hope. And Bloch said, you know, hope is not an abstraction. It has to be grounded in the dynamic of history. And I really agree with that, you know.
Awesome. What a treat. Thank you so much, Vijay,
Please,
for this
yeah.
conversation. And it's so lovely to have you here and to participate in this conversation. We have food after this in the KS space. All you have to do, if you would like to hang around, is just follow us and we will walk there. But thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Thanks.